and in person. Lots happening and going on. And man, I tell you, I don't know about you, but the wonder and mystery of the birth of God's Son has never left me. And I pray it never does. You've heard my stories. My sister and I, we didn't grow up in a Christian home, but my sister, who is only 2 years older, my other sisters were older and gone. But I remember sitting around the Christmas tree at night. And even though we didn't know what all Christmas was about, we knew that there was something special about that night. We knew it had to do with this baby Jesus. And we would just sit in front of the tree for hours. Now, most of that was trying to figure out what was in the presents, if I'm honest. You've heard my stories about the tinsel tree. Any of you guys ever seen? Maybe some of you may have to look like, YouTube, and you get the retro tinsel, the little silver tree, and the color wheel that would change colors, that make a sound. I think we were hypnotized by that. But I never will get over, and I pray I never do, the wonder, the mystery of Jesus' birth. And so as we prepare our hearts for Christmas, today especially, I want us to focus on an aspect that maybe we don't always focus on when we think of the birth of Christ. But think about it this way. Are you guys ready? That Jesus is the demonstration of God's love for us. Jesus is the demonstration of God's love for us. And I want us to spend this morning just kind of unpacking what that means. There are a lot of things that we think about when we think of Jesus, that Jesus was kind and he was compassionate and he was merciful, that Jesus healed people, the amazing ones, that the one with leprosy, that Jesus went and touched him to be healed. And nobody touched a leper. I mean, that was just unheard of. You would become ceremonially unclean. We don't get all that in our non-Jewish mindset. But it was a big deal for them. It was huge. And Jesus went and laid his hand on someone that no one had touched in a long time. And he was healed. And then there was the man that was born blind. One of my favorite stories. I have so many. The Bible's so much fun. If you're not in the habit of daily reading the Bible, you should jump into it. I'm continually amazed. So think about this. I read when I read the Bible, I try to put myself in that as if I were there witnessing it, particularly the Gospels. And so here's Jesus. He's walking with the disciples. And you guys realize this. There was always an entourage with them. It was never just Jesus and the 12. There were a bunch. And they're walking along. The 12 were just right close to Jesus. And there's this man on the side of the road, and he's begging. And he was blind. And apparently the man was well known because the disciples asked Jesus this question. So this man was born blind. Who sinned, him or his parents? I put myself in that situation and think of the blind man. He hears the commotion. He knows this is Jesus because word of Jesus was spread. Jesus, we kind of get the idea, and some people think of Jesus as this carpenter that turned itinerant preacher. What we really need to understand is Jesus was a full-on rabbi. He was a recognized rabbi of his day. And so here comes Rabbi Jesus with his entourage, and all of a sudden they stop in front of this blind man and say, who sinned, him or his parents? I'm shocked. I'm shocked the dude didn't go, I'm blind, but I can still hear. You know what I mean? Because he hears this. The poor guy hears all this. And Jesus said, it's not like that at all. That's kind of what Jesus was getting across. Jesus is like, God is going to demonstrate his glory through this man. And Jesus went over, picture this. This guy's blind, so I'm going to close my eyes. And I'm going to dramatize this. I don't think this is exactly the way it was played out, but this is the way I hear it in my mind. This blind guy, who sinned, him or his parents? And Jesus is not like that, but so that God would be glorified. Then you hear, and then there's something kind of moist and getting smeared. Jesus made mud and put it on the guy's eyes. We're like, that's so weird. Why would Jesus do that? In John chapter 1, John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? Through him, everything that was made has been made, and without him was not anything made that has been made. Did you get what John just said right there? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And everything that has been made through this Word. Jesus is Creator God. The Apostle Paul reiterates that in Colossians chapter 1. So Creator God is walking by. Here's a man that was born blind. And when I read this, I'm immediately transformed back to Genesis, where it says, and he formed man out of the dust of the earth. Jesus made, Creator God, Jesus made the guy some new eyes. I'm amazed at thinking all this. And so Jesus came, and Jesus healed, and Jesus touched, and Jesus changed lives. Jesus was the demonstration of God's love for us. If you want to know what love is, I know some of you just sang that song in your head. I want to know what love is. Well, if you want to know what love is, if you're of an age, you know what that one is, or if you listen to the 80s station or 70s. If you want to know what love is, look at Jesus. Because Jesus is the demonstration of God's love for us. And then I love it, John, I just quoted the first part of chapter 1, but you get to John 14 and it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's one tiny little sentence in there, but let's not skip past that. The eternal Son of God became flesh. And some of you have heard me say this, but I remember the first time this really kind of settled in on me. I was blown away. Don't think that Jesus, God the Son, came and just kind of put on a body for a little bit. The way I call this is Jesus didn't just come put on a skin suit for a little while. Jesus didn't just come and take on a body for a little bit. Once and for all time, the eternal God the Son became flesh. He became one of us, fully God, fully human. And then in verse 18, we kind of get a little bit of an insight into part of what Jesus came to do. John chapter 1, verse 18 says this, no one has ever seen God, the only God, that is God the Word. Remember, this is John. He just got through saying the Word was with God and the Word was God. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. And that's why Jesus kind of marveled. He kind of chided Philip a little bit when Philip at one point says, just show us the Father and it'll be enough. And Jesus is like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. How long have I been with you, Philip, and you haven't known me? I am eternal God become flesh. So as we dig into this a little bit this morning, preparing our hearts to celebrate, I want you to remember that Jesus came to make the Father known, that Jesus is God's demonstration of his love for us. 1 John chapter 1 says, that which was from the beginning, this is again John the apostle who wrote the Gospel of John, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we've seen it, and testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and we have heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things to you so that your joy may be made complete. The Apostle John, the disciple whom Jesus loves, as he refers to himself, is writing saying, hey, look, we're telling you that God made himself known to us. We got to see it. We walked with him. We got to see him perform miracles. We got to see God's love demonstrated on a daily basis through Jesus. Jesus came and made the Father known to us. And we're witnesses of these things. And so we're writing these things to you. And I love it when I read that, when he says writing these things to you, I'm thinking to us. Those of us who didn't get to walk with Jesus, those of us who didn't get to see his miracles firsthand, those of us who didn't get to bodily see Jesus God's love demonstrated for us. John says, we writing these things to you. And I love the Gospel of John, but all of John, because he writes from a very unique perspective. He says, we're writing these things to you so that your joy may be made complete, that you can see God demonstrating his love for us. And then a little bit further down, or further in the letter, 1 John 4, 8 through 10, he says, anyone who does not know God anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest to us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. And this is love. Not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the, here's your word for the week, propitiation for our sin. To be the full satisfaction of God's wrath for our sin. That's what his Son came to do. And then I love it, the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 1 says this, chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. Long ago, and if you're like me, like all of a sudden I can see the Star Wars thing, but this isn't a made-up story. This is a real story. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. John, or the writer of Hebrews, reiterates that it's God the Son who is creator God. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, that's that word propitiation, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. I don't know if you can tell, but I get excited about these kind of things. Because in our world, when we say that we love stuff, we can say, because in English, English is the most messed up language, I believe, on the planet. It's not very clear most of the time. Anybody love ice cream? Anybody? Mm-hmm. Cookies and cream, that's the best. Oh, there you go. Ah, yes, my people. Bluebell homemade vanilla runs a close second, but cookies and cream is the best, especially if you know what a Brahms is. You can get a cookies and cream shake at Brahms. Anybody love puppies? Anybody love puppies? Yeah. I'm not going to ask about cats because usually there's some mean comments. You know, I love cats. And then they have, anyway. How about babies? Anybody love babies? Yeah. If you're married, you love your spouse. You love your sisters and your brothers. Jesus tells us to love one another like he loved us. And so we use the word love for a lot of things. Some people love pickles. Some people love pickles only during a certain time of life, you know. But we use love, and it really kind of gets messed up in our wording. And in the world, here's what is really hard, and because it's used for a variety of different things, I've sadly counseled couples that say we don't love each other anymore. And what they're talking about is, for them, they think love is an emotion, that love is a feeling that comes and goes. You need to understand, when we say that Jesus is God's demonstration of love for us, it has nothing to do with feelings or emotion. When we're talking about love in the Bible, and it does refer to a couple of other times, love one another with brotherly affection. That's a phileo. That's a brotherly kind of love that we have, a familial kind of love. There is a romantic kind of love that it refers to at times, but whenever you are commanded to love, it is always the unconditional love that God demonstrates first for us. That God loved us. It's not these bubbly feelings. I love this. Whenever I see young couples together and it's so cute and they're holding hands and you hear the hearts, you know, just popping. That's cool. That's more of the romantic kind of love. But God's love for us is so much deeper. So let me give you quickly 3 things and we'll wrap it up this morning about God's love for us. First of all, God's love for us is unchanging. Isn't that good to know? God's never going to look at you and say, I just don't love you anymore. He won't say that. Jeremiah 31:3, I love the way that it's phrased here. He says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, therefore I have continued my faithfulness to you. Isn't that cool? That God's love for us doesn't change. It stays the same. It doesn't change no matter how good you are. It doesn't change no matter how bad you are. It doesn't change no matter how many times you stumble or fall. God's love for you doesn't change. Now I know Satan loves to kind of mess with our heads a little bit, especially when we mess up. And some of us, we can mess up pretty big sometimes, can't we? And Satan loves to come and say, God doesn't love you anymore. God doesn't love you anymore. You need to know that God's love for us, but particularly God's love for you, is unchanging. The second one is that God's love for us is demonstrated. That's something that you need to know, that love is always demonstrated. But sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, I talk with people in the world, and I get it. I get it. When we talk about the love of God for us, and they look and they see this messed up world, this world that's full of pain and grief and hurt and sometimes just plain evil, they say, well, man, it's hard for me to believe that God is love. And kind of the implied statement behind there is, if God is love, then let him show it. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrates his love for us. And that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us on the cross. And I love this, 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says, for our sake, you want God to show his love? You want God to demonstrate his love for us? For our sake, he made him, I have to put this in, God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God. You want God to demonstrate his love? Look at the cross. Jesus on the cross, living the perfect life we could not. Jesus fulfilled the law. And in fact, he made it obsolete, the writer of Hebrews says, because Jesus did everything that we could not do. He fulfilled all of God's requirements because we could not. And then in that perfect sinless state, God took our sin, laid it upon Jesus on the cross. And then on the cross, God poured his wrath out upon Jesus that we owed. God made him who knew no sin to become sin, our sin, so that we could become the righteousness of God in him. And I know what you're thinking. Well, there are times I don't feel very righteous. Well, it's not talking about like how you feel, first of all. But it's talking about made in right standing with God. That's what being righteous is. That you are made in right standing with God because of what Jesus did on the cross. That is God demonstrating his love for us. The ultimate expression of God's love. And then the verse that is probably the best known Bible verse in the whole world of all time. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him, that's not a head knowledge, by the way, that's a trusting with your heart. Whoever trusts in him wouldn't perish, but would have everlasting life. God demonstrated his love for us. And then finally, God's love for us is based on him and not us. And that sounds kind of weird to say. Let me explain that just a little bit. You didn't do anything to make God start loving you. You just didn't. You're like, I don't know, I'm not a bad guy. I'm a pretty good person. It doesn't matter. You didn't do anything to make God start loving you. Now, some of you are like, oh, well, that kind of hurts a little bit. Well, the flip side is even better. You can't do anything to make him stop. Because God's love for you doesn't depend on you. It doesn't depend on who you are. It doesn't depend on who your parents are. It doesn't depend on power or prestige or your goodness or your not goodness. It doesn't depend on you at all. God's love depends on him. For God so loved the world, it started with him, that he gave his only son. Romans chapter 2 says this. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. So what anything you did, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, they point to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. What Paul is saying here is it doesn't depend on you, and aren't you glad because of verse 23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None of you measure up, and that's me too. None of us measure up to God. None of us deserve God's love for us. None of us deserve God's mercy and his grace and his compassion and his kindness. We don't deserve it. And we're justified by his grace as a gift. See, it depends on him. God just said, I love you. And because I love you, I don't want you to go for eternity without relationship with me. And so God offers his gift of righteousness, of being in right standing through Jesus by grace, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith, by trusting. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. This is something that blows our minds when we think about, well, how are people in the Old Testament saved? Through Jesus, they were looking from the other side to the cross. They were looking from the other side to the Messiah. They were looking from the other side to God's grace that was going to be manifest. And man, when we go back and read the Old Testament through the lens of this side of the cross, we can, I don't know if you guys have ever done a Passover service or a Seder service, but we're going, how did they not see Jesus in all of this? But God held off on judgment for sin for this. It says this was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. And here's why. Verse 26. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Let me tell you the way I like to say that. Because we think, well, couldn't God have just forgiven us? Why? Jesus didn't have to go through all that, did he? Well, remember the Garden of Gethsemane? As Jesus prayed and agonized, and one of the best illustrations or examples that we see of somebody submitting their will to God's, Jesus said, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours. There was no other way. Here's the way I like to put verse 26. The one who demanded payment for our sin is the one who became payment for our sin. That's the demonstration of God's love for us. And listen, as we head into Christmas, I want you this Christmas to take some time, and whether it's sitting at the tree with your hypnotic tinsel color, changing color tree, whatever it is, make some time between now and Christmas. Maybe it's on Christmas Eve. That's really a cool time to do this, but just contemplate that God demonstrated his love for us by sending Jesus. Jesus is God's demonstration of love. That he came. He left his throne in glory, that he became flesh. He took on flesh just like us. He was tempted in every way that we are, and yet without sin, so that he could become the payment of sin for us, that we could have a right standing with God. Let's pray.